Greetings, fellow quitters, and welcome back to the CMDQ podcast. We're your hosts. I'm John Pelfrey.
And I'm Maari Casey.
We're back with the next installment in our Summer of Scaling. And today we're talking about one of the most important components of sustainable growth, working with subcontractors.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to take on more work than you can accomplish as an individual, it might be time to add somebody to your team. How do you do that? And how do you keep the work quality consistent and the business running smoothly? That's the question that we're going to answer today.
Mm-hmm. That is a big question. But one of the simplest answer is to give your subcontractors a great scope. So let's dive into how to write a scope that sets clear expectations and helps avoid unnecessary liability, even when you add more cooks to your kitchen. So, okay, warm-up question, John. Do you have any horror stories about misaligned expectations from a subcontractor or a freelancer's perspective?
I mean, I probably shouldn't talk about most of them, but I think this is just a general thing. At horror stories, there were definitely times in the agency world where we had account managers who would talk to clients. And I think a lot of times what would happen is the communication would get lost between the creatives and what the creatives were either capable of doing within a given time period, or the skills that we had available to us, and then what the account managers would agree that we could do. And me as the project manager person, I sat in the middle of that. And I was just basically always told, like, hey, I know that the timeline is impossible, and I know that we don't have enough people to do this thing, but you got to make it work somehow. And my answer to that every single time was always, so which project do you not want them to work on? And the answer was, well, they have to work on all of them at the same time. And I would say,
get them all done perfectly,
and brains and, whatever. And it happened kind of regularly. And, it was one of those things where there were times when we worked on the weekends, there were times that we worked at night, there were times where we didn't sleep, and it was all sort of for the greater good, whatever that means. And at the end of the day, everybody would just get burned out and tired and angry and grumpy and eventually leave. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Essentially, I remember one where we worked all weekend. I mean, all weekend. I don't think I slept maybe 4 hours in the course of 3 days to get something done. And then at the end of all of it, I'm not sure that the project actually made the client any money, which is really part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You do all the work and you think like, this is going to be great for the client. And then it's like, didn't really move the needle. And the truth is we stayed up all weekend and we're so tired. Like, of course the work's not going to be any good.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess you've done that before once or twice.
I always felt like we were on the end of the line of just pushing it forward, where it would go from the client, go to the account, go to the project manager, come to us. And they were like, wait a second. And everyone's like, I'm out. It's yours. You touched it. It's a hot potato and you got the potato. And so that's always kind of what happened. And then, if you had a scope that was not clear or was unrealistic, it was a lot of times that just figure it out. And you're just like, it's figuring out an impossible thing. So yeah, that is hard. And it leads to a lot of like collateral damage, usually with the project either not being delivered to the quality that it should be, or being delivered late, or being delivered partially finished, or being delivered with now a lot of angry people behind it. And yeah, I mean, that happens in agency world, but that can also happen when you are managing subcontractors. So it is good to take those lessons that you've learned in agency world and hopefully translate that to working with subcontractors, because it will save you many times.
Yeah. And, that was one of the lessons that we learned. Of course, this was, in my mind, early in this idea of using freelancers or subcontractors, from the outside. And we really honestly didn't have enough headcount to pull off things a lot of times. We did start to look for freelancers to fill that gap. And this would have been, 10, 12 years ago. I don't know, a long time ago. It felt odd and scary to hand off your work to somebody who didn't work there and didn't understand all of the things with the details, and they weren't in the meetings and they weren't whatever. And you were just like, here, make this thing and go. And honestly, that's, when I met you and we started talking about Uncompany and how that could work and make things easier for clients and all that, it was such a breath of fresh air for me, because I was trying to swim against the tide to pull it all together and make it work. And I couldn't do it in that particular environment at all. I didn't have enough information to provide to the freelancers. The scopes weren't clear enough. The timelines were too tight. The budgets were too low. That all the constraints just worked against me. I felt like, and it was really, really difficult to be able to build a process. And fortunately now, like, I think people, whether you're a freelancer and you're trying to build your first sort of job with some subcontractors, or if you're an agency or an in-house agency or whatever, I think the industry has started to learn and understand how to work and how to make this thing function a little bit better. And that you do need some more lead time. You can't just call people up at like 8 p.m. on a Friday and be like, hey, can you work all night? Like, no.
Mhm.
All right. Well, let's talk about scopes then. One of my favorite things. Yeah. So what is a scope? What do we include in a scope? How do we do this so that we can, and I should preface this with, what is a scope that will include some subcontractors in it? Because that might look one where you just like agree with a client and you kind of know what's going on. Like, you got to get more detail. You're going to pull outside people in, right?
Yeah. Well, especially if you're pulling outside people in, because I think if you have the benefit of knowing the client, and I've worked with the client, or sometimes if you worked within an agency, you work with the client, like, you know, the nuances, you know, when they say this, they mean this, you know, that's been tested. But if you're bringing in somebody from the outside who doesn't have the relationship that you have, then it's like super, super essential to be 1,000% clear and reduce all squishiness. I mean, as we talked about, like, okay, whenever we're describing scopes or requests that come in from clients, we're like, what's the level of squishiness that we have here? Because you have to do your best to try to eliminate it as much as possible. And so, you know, we just did a How to Scope Better webinar, which we'll have that video on our website too, but it can be relatively simple. So I described the scope as a hamburger, a delicious hamburger, when I was talking about this webinar, where it's like, you know, you have the project overview, which is the top part, which is the bun. You have the payment, which is the bottom part. That's the finishing part. That's the bottom bun. And then you have the goodness in the middle, which is all the stuff that makes up the hamburger. And that is like the objectives of the project. What are we doing here? Like, what's the point? What are we trying to achieve? The deliverables, and the deliverables of the project need to be even more clear than typically people realize. And that's something that I learned when I was starting out, where I would be like, 3 to 4 social media posts, you know, a blog, and there's no link associated, or like a video, there's no video link associated. You know, so you have to be really, really specific down to what the specs are around the deliverables. If you're doing design or writing and things like that, what's the word count, things like that. So deliverables, timeline, because you and I both know and have been a part of many projects that the timeline has been squishy, and that's the squishy part of the scope. And we're like, I don't know, it just needs to be done in like Q1. Well, that's 3 months long. And when you're stringing along a project, you're stringing along a freelancer, or a subcontractor, or a client's attention span for 3 months, that project, the work that starts to pile up around meetings and emails and that kind of stuff, becomes a lot more than you planned for. So the timeline, focusing on the timeline and reducing squishiness around the timeline is really important, especially when you're working with subs. Because if I have a project and I tell you I need to get it done in January, and I don't talk to you, or the client doesn't get back to me until the last week of January, and then I jump to you to be like, this needs to get done in January. I told you January, where you told me the entire month of January. You didn't tell me the last week. And now I have a project booked up. So it's really, really clear, making the timeline really, really clear, and making sure that everyone's aligned on that is important. And then putting milestones into your projects. And this is my first subcontracting experience, I think, is where I really learned this lesson of how to not micromanage. And that is important, because you'll drive everybody crazy. You'll drive yourself crazy. You'll drive your subcontractors crazy, and you'll end up with a bad product. The way to help that is to establish a kickoff and then milestones throughout the projects. And you say, here's milestone 1. This is what I expect to see. And then you get out of the way and you let them manage their own time within kickoff to milestone 1. If you have no milestones and you have no clear understanding, if you're managing subcontractors, what the heck they're doing, that is a little stressful. So having milestones is a good way just to like knock on the door and peek in and be like, oh, you got milestone 1 done. I can relax. So it's really nice to have that in place. It's also really helpful to have milestones for billing purposes, so that you can bill incrementally as opposed to waiting until the end. And then putting in revisions. This was something I didn't learn for years and years and years, that revisions are really where scopes can just get crazy. If you don't have the number of revisions baked into your scope, then the client can just expect to do revisions forever and ever. Amen. And, you know, that can be a problem if you expect it to do 2 to 3 revisions and client is on 6 to 7 revisions, and you're not getting compensated for that. So that's kind of the rough outline of what needs to be included in a good scope.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add on to that with the revisions thing, because revision hell is real. It it
sounds
once you get
so
into that
painful.
spiral, you can't, it's hard to pull out of it.
Mhm.
So I would add into that if you say that we're going to do 2 rounds of revisions and then final files, let's say, and then the client comes back and says, hey, I'd like a third round of revision. If your scope is written so that it's 2 rounds of revisions and then final files, you could say, I'm sorry, that's not in scope. Or you could say, great, well, I have this clause down here that says I'm this amount per hour to
Mhm.
do additional work or additional revisions or additional whatever. And then you can say, like, this is our third round. And so I'm going to bill you at my hourly rate of whatever they agreed to do that for you, with the added understanding that the timeline also pushes out for this project.
Right.
And that was the part that, as the project manager, used to always drive me crazy because the timeline never moved. The number of revisions could be infinite.
Mhm.
And I, tiny little brain, I never understood how I was supposed to bend time and space in order
Right.
to make that work. But it was always like, well, the client deadline is this, and it doesn't matter what they want. But
Yeah.
other things to include in your scope would be an additional, fee for extra hours if you're going to do revisions.
Mhm.
And then an understanding that each round of revisions, or each time you ask me for something, adds and increases that timeline. And you could put parameters around that too.
Yeah.
Like you can say every round of revisions will add 3 days to the timeline before the next milestone.
Mhm.
Whatever. So think about how you're setting that part up too. It's not always just about the project description and the goals and the audience and the deliverables, but it is also about being really specific about how you're going to protect your time, and also how you can protect the timeline for the client. Because if the client needs it by a certain date, but they're the ones that are always adding the new stuff, like they're not going to
Mhm.
meet sort of like, business goals either. So
Yeah. And it's when you're starting to work with subcontractors, you have to realize that you're stepping into a new role. You're no longer, maybe you're a designer and now you're bringing in other designers to work with you. So you're still a designer. It's maybe in skill, but now you're jumping into the role of project or account manager as well. And so you have to think that way. You have to think about, like, you're managing the client's time and the client's expectations, and you're also now managing your subcontractor freelancers' time and their expectations. And you have to be able to communicate between those two. So you're really kind of playing this in between. Like, client needs it by the 27th. I know the freelancer is going to be out of office starting the 25th. I need to encourage them to get this done by the 22nd. So we have some buffer. Like, you have to really start thinking in different directions, because it's no longer just about you delivering something. It's about you managing people who are delivering stuff. And that's a hard skill to learn. But if you want to scale and you want to grow, it's really important to learn that. But that is a big switch. I think if you're coming into it with a certain skill set, you're a designer, you're a writer, you're a video person, whatever it might be, and now you're working with subcontractors, well, now you're doing a totally new role. And you really have to, like, learn some skills and even talk to people, talk to project managers and say, how do you manage this type of stuff? And they will give you some tips. But it's important to understand that you're making a new step into a new role when you're working with multiple people.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great piece of advice. I was about to say it myself. If you are a typical creative type person and you've never been a project manager before, call up some of your former coworkers and just say, hey,
Apologize. And then,
yeah, yeah, hey, I'm sorry that I used to, give you a lot of crap about this, but I'm now in this role a little bit. Can you give me some ideas here? Or can you
Mhm.
tell me, like, or let's talk about a time when I was the creative and you were the project manager and this thing happened. What was it like from your perspective? You know, and any
Yeah.
of that's, buy them a coffee, reminisce about old times and learn something. Yeah. It's always fun. All right. So what are some of the quality control concerns or issues too? Because we've talked about time, we've talked about budget,
Mhm.
we've talked about all that. But then the last piece is like, the quality control.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why people are afraid to work with some contractors when you're a freelancer is because you're so used to owning every single aspect of, like, things that are going to the client, and then you're letting that go a little bit, which is really scary because it's your reputation, it's all of that stuff. There's the risk if they don't deliver, then I'm going to have to redo it, and then I'm going to have to pay them still, and there's that weirdness. So that's why it's important, again, to, like, bake in milestones, understand who you're working with. So when you're getting in there, understanding who you're going in there with. Like, I've seen their work. I know people who have worked with them. I feel comfortable about the skill that they can deliver. They work with this type of client. We've had coffee and they can communicate like humans, whatever it might be. But do a little bit of due diligence upfront before you start working with a subcontractor. And ask them questions, be like, and be direct. Here's my concern. This is the first time I've done this, like, or I've had a bad experience in the past, around these reasons. Like, share your concerns and have them talk to you about it. It should be an open conversation. And then I think when you're starting to work in building that contract out with them, with your subcontractor, because definitely have a contract. You have a scope, that scope converts to a contract. They sign it, you are agreeing on this is what they're delivering. Make sure that those milestones and those timelines are baked in there, and say, like, this milestone is going to be for me and you to chat. We're going to check in on things. I'm going to make sure everything feels solid. And then here's the milestone I have with the client to present. So that's going to be like, you're going to have milestones and check-ins with your subcontractors, with your freelancers, and then you're going to have milestones and check-ins with your clients. And so making sure that you have those in place is really important, so that you understand what's happening and they understand that you're going to give some feedback and that you're comfortable with what's being delivered before it goes to the client. So I think that's really important, because if you don't, you might be walking into a client presentation and that's the first time you've seen the work, or maybe you just saw it 10 minutes before the presentation and you don't like it, but you can't change it. And that's not enough time. So make sure that you're building in those buffers and that margin between when you're getting work delivered from your freelancers and subcontractors to when you are presenting it to the client, and making sure that they understand that it's a conversation, that their work that you're working on them with is being delivered to the client that you're managing, and that there is going to be feedback and stuff like that. So realistic feedback. Don't go off the rails, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. If you own the client relationship and that client has been with you for a while and they trust you now to like expand your team and hire some subcontractors and stuff, then they are really still trusting your expertise with them and your level of work. They're expecting your level of work with everything that comes in there. So making sure that you have those quality control checks in with your subs just makes a lot of sense. So what are some of the risks that you might run from a business perspective if you're looking at hiring some subcontractors? What are the liabilities? What liabilities could that create for your business? The other thing that pops up for me is like, how do you manage cash flow a little bit? Because now you're the middleman in that, and that can get a little tricky and dicey. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think liability wise, that's why it's so important to take the scope that you write and make sure you start with a really clean, clear scope that is agreed on with the client, agreed on with your subcontractors. And then you convert that into a contract for the subcontractor. So they are signing it, you are signing it. It's a piece of paper, it's a document that you're both agreeing to. So making sure that is done up front. And I would say, hopefully you've had some clarity around, like, before you even sign this, like, I'm dealing with the client relationship. So my expectation is that I'm doing all the communication, emailing, following up, etc. Or if you want to, like, I have to file with you emailing them, just make sure you copy me, whatever that looks like, but make sure that process is all really clear. And then, get that contract signed, and then also understand that they are not your employee. So you can give them work, they can do it, but let them do it on their own. So don't say, I need you to be logging in between these times and checking in. Like, don't over manage them, because you don't want to do that anyway. It's too much time. So giving them this clear guidelines, this clear milestones and the deliverables of what is expected and when it is expected, and then letting them do their process and trusting that it's getting done. If they don't meet the milestones, they miss deadlines and things like that, then you have something to fall back on. Like, well, we signed this document. You said you're going to have it done. This is what you said you were going to get done. And when it wasn't get done, it's not getting done. We have a problem we need to work on. But make sure that's upfront and clear. And I think some people are always curious about letting their clients know if there's subcontractors involved. I always say, like, it's totally up to you. It's your relationship with the client. But obviously our business is working with freelancers, so our clients know that. But, I would just ask, if you're starting a client relationship at the beginning, and be like, hey, I do this. I love doing design work for you, but I also work with a ton of other freelancers. Are you open to me working with a larger team if I pull people in? And just see what that looks like for them. I think at this point in the world that we live in, I'm not concerned about it as much anymore, because freelancers everyone's using them. But I think where it might go awry is if you're being secretive about it in a way that's unnecessary. Like, don't be secretive about it. So I think those things are really good to make sure are really clear. If you're working with a client that maybe has like private information or things that they don't want to share, if they're working on a pitch, maybe that's kind of stealth mode, then making sure you understand all of that stuff up front and communicating that with your subs. So if you're working on an agency pitch that needs to be kind of kept under wraps, like letting them know this cannot get out, like they have to sign an NDA. If you have an NDA or if a client has an NDA, making sure all of that is really buttoned up. We have an ICA agreement, which is an independent contractor agreement that covers various things around privacy and around ownership of work, ownership of client, et cetera. Like I would encourage you, if you keep working with subs, to create your own. There's a bunch of templates and things like that you can find, but just something that outlines expectations and how we work and things like that. I think those things are not overly complicated to get in place and give you some levels of protection. Again, it's just adding another layer of clarity around the working relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. I always lean toward the side of transparency when it comes to working with clients. So if you're adding subs, I would simply say, hey, I'm a graphic designer. I'm going to talk to my friend who's a copywriter and bring that person in to the project, and I'll still be your main point of contact and everything will run through. That's a really straightforward, easy way to do it. Or, hey, I'll be the art director, but I'm going to hire 2 more graphic designers to help me out with this workload because it's a lot and we need to get it done within a small time frame. And so I'm not going to be able to do all that myself.
Yeah.
But it's still going to be my quality, everything under me. That's an easy conversation to have. And yeah, like you said, most people they'll be fine with that. I mean, as long as the timeline and the budget work, clients just need work done. That's, at the end of the day, that's usually all they care about. Awesome. So what do you do if the work that the subcontractor delivers doesn't line up with the scope? You mentioned this just a little bit.
Yeah.
How does that conversation go? You kind of blew through it really, really quickly, but I just want to expand that out a little bit more. Let's say that I delivered work that doesn't fit the expected deliverables. How would you stop that?
Yeah, it's hard. Those are some of the hardest situations. And those are the situations that still like give me ulcers to think about.
Yeah.
Because it's a bummer. I mean, hopefully you don't have a lot of that happen. Maybe if you're working, like we're working continuously with subcontractors, maybe once or twice a year. But if you're doing it, if you're doing your due diligence upfront and you understand who you're working with, what they can do, what they can deliver, you've talked to other people, oh yeah, this person's great and they're great at delivering, whatever. If you've done that up front, then, and you kind of button yourself up from a documentation standpoint, ICA, agreement, contracts, then usually you should be fine, because you're also checking in from a milestone perspective. I'm checking in, like, I got to milestone number 2 and they still didn't deliver. I'm going to go ahead and fire the subcontractor and bring somebody else in. When you get into situations like that, then I think you have to try to be as direct and non-emotional as possible. Like, hey, unfortunately, this project isn't working out for us. We agreed to this contract. I have a contract here. Milestone wasn't met. Milestone 2 was kind of loosely met, but not really delivered. And like, because I need to know that this is going to get done by the 27th for our client, like I'm going to have to go ahead and let you off this project. I will pay you this much, which gets us to this, whatever you feel like good about. You're going to have to say, this is how it's going to be. When you get into a situation where you don't want to pay them anything because maybe they're not delivering or it's just a hot mess, then that's what you need to have clarified in your ICA agreement. Like if work is not delivered or if client doesn't pay me because work is not delivered, then I will not pay you or whatever that looks like. We've had that happen like one time in the history of the last 12 years. So typically I don't think that happens. Another way to help with, if a client doesn't pay you for reasons not related to work delivery, that's where it's also good to make sure you're billing incrementally, right? So it's like, I'm at least got 50% of the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and pay you 25 or 50% of what I got paid, whatever that looks like. But yeah, I think those situations around subcontractor conflicts and delivery are the stickiest. And that's where it's really important to have those incremental check-ins and make sure that we're communicating. And usually I would say now I have a pretty solid red flag alert that comes up. I have a pretty good gut. You'll get better and better about being able to sniff out the situations before you get into them. The more you work, you might just have to go through a couple situations where you're getting burned. A couple ways to help you get through that is to make sure that you're giving yourself enough margin on what you're paying your subcontractors. So you're looking at 30 to 40% on top of what you pay them so that if the client ends up only paying you 50%, you're not completely losing your shirt to like pay them back, pay the subcontractor back. Some of those things you'll learn the more you work, but yeah, that's why it's so important for you to build in those incremental check-ins and just do some due diligence upfront before you start working with somebody.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that before you go to that person, you need to be really honest with yourself to say, did I fail to communicate the expectation accurately or clearly?
Right.
Because it's not always someone else's fault. And as a project manager and a person who sat in the middle, I've seen the communication failure happen from everyone. It happened from the client. from the account managers. It's happened from me as the project manager. It's happened from the creative director or the designer doing the work. Or like where did the failure of communication happen? And if I'm the cause of that, I need to be honest with myself about that before I have a conversation with the subcontractor.
Yeah.
Because that's a totally different conversation. At that point, it's, we didn't deliver this thing. I should have been more clear with you about the deadline or the scope or the whatever. And now that we're in this pickle that I have played a role in, will you help me? That's a totally different discussion, but it's also one that could legitimately happen if you're new to this. So consider your own role in the process. Try to take yourself out of it or talk to someone that you trust and say, this is what happened. This is the situation. Am I at fault here? Did I mess this up?
Or as a client, do the clients, a lot of times I've seen folks do this too, where they have a hard time going back to the client and pushing them. And so they dump it on the subcontractor or the freelancers when it might have been the client that's really kind of on, bad behavior style has kind of jumped out of scope. And so you have to go back and defend your subs and be like, no, actually, they did deliver. Here's where the breakdown was. And so that's part of it too.
Yeah. So there's a lot of those kind of roles. And when you start become this middle person between the client and the subcontractor, all of those things start to come into play, and it can get really confusing. And I really like your suggestion of building some margin into the hourly rate that you're paying the subs, not just in case you don't get paid, but also because this is the work that you are doing, and you should get paid for that part of it.
Yeah.
So if you're paying the sub $50 an hour and you're charging the client, let's say $80 an hour, just for easy math, that $30 an hour in an ideal world is profit for you. But sometimes it's the cost of the work that you need to do in order to get the billable time for your sub. So, just think through that a little bit. But yeah, every email you write, every administrative decision that you make, all of that needs to be covered by the rate you're charging the client.
Yeah.
All right. Well, lightning round. Let's go. So what's the number one thing business owners fail to specify in subcontractor scopes?
Revisions.
100%. Yeah. Revisions. And I will add to revisions, ownership. Who is responsible for what in the process? So in that revisions situation, my biggest pet peeve is the client has to approve something, and we don't know which person or who at the client is the final say on the approval. It just says client approves. You really need to put in there, Maari Casey, CEO of Uncompany, approves, or John Pelfrey, Director of Operations. There has to be a final decision maker at the client who is the approver. That will save so much more time than saying the client, because then you might have to get approval from like 15 different people. Totally kill the time. So be super clear about that one. And it'll save you a lot of pain and agony, I promise. All right. How far ahead of your deadline should you set the subcontractor's deadline?
I think it depends on the complexity of the project. I would say when it's the first time you've worked with somebody, I would give more space. So if it's like I'm delivering brand logos, for instance, give at least 3 days, 3 to 4 days of review so that you can review and make some suggestions, and they can go back and tweak it. And then you can have one more check-in before you submit it. As you work with somebody more and more and you get to know, oh yeah, 100% Sarah's going to deliver. It's going to be awesome. Jenna's going to crush it. Then you can reduce that over the course of time.
Yep. That's a great suggestion. Yeah. 3 to 5 days if they're new, and then work it from there. Totally agree. All right. Do you always have a backup plan in case a subcontractor disappears or backs out?
I think it's good to always have somebody in the pipeline. This was, we have a pipeline. We are a pipeline. So we have a lot of backups. Whenever we start a project, especially with a new client, if somebody's not interested or whatever reason, we'll have a couple people kind of in the queue. We haven't had anybody ghost us in a while as far as a freelancer disappearing, but it's always good to have either, especially if you don't have the skill set. If I'm a designer and I'm going to subcontractor with a designer, okay, well, if they bail on me, then I can just not sleep and get it done. But if I'm a designer and I'm working with a copywriter and they bail on me, then I'm kind of stuck. So I do think it's good to at least have a pretty large network of people that you can reach out to if something happens and you get in a situation, just because that'll help you sleep better at night. But hopefully you've again done the work, done the due diligence to understand this person is not going to bail on me. We're checking in, et cetera, et cetera. But it's always good to have a plan B, C, D, E, F, and so on, just in case.
Yeah, I've learned this one the hard time on multiple occasions. You always have a backup plan, and then you always have a backup to the backup plan,
Yeah.
just in case. And there's always that like break glass in case of backup
Mhm.
plan that, and you want that to be the last one. The last backup plan is I stay up all night and do the work myself.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
that should not be backup plan. A. That should be like backup plan C or D or E down the list.
Yeah.
Yeah, if
Definitely.
that means build a bigger network before you do this, or just know that you have friends that can hop in or people that can hop in, you know, always have a backup plan and then maybe one behind that before you have to stay up all night. Because fortunately, and we've all learned this the hard way, if you have to stay up all night, inevitably by 4 a.m. or so, you're not going to be thinking clearly and your work is going to suffer and the client's going to be able to
Mhm.
see that, especially when they're talking to you and you can barely keep your eyes open.
No.
Um, well, that's it for this quick quit this week. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining and listening in. And until next time, I'm John,
And I'm Maari.
and we're reminding you that quitters can win and winners can quit.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Command Q or Uncompany.